People who have heard deathbed confessions, what were some interesting ones?
My time to shine. I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich, for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out, and occasionally I take care of some handy-like work, fix a leaking shower head and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away. Such is life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance, her words. I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest. Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an East Germany company. He told me that he once run over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during the Second World War and that she slept with very high-up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone, and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more than 5 babies during that time.
Not my story, but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bedbound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encourage family members to keep their company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now, this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations. During her hospice care, however, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university, in fact. Her family was supportive of her decision, but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas or what have you. One day, they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly, the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and fucking died. Edit. Thanks for the awards, FWIW. The hospice worker said her family eventually thought it was hilarious. Go Bucks.
My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad, she didn't remember who her family were and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting where they were and claim she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one, and that would be her again for months. The only memory she had left at the end was that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully, and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone, but she didn't know where. He'd died sometime earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. "My John will be home soon," she would say. Or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say, "Thought that was my John." It was heartbreaking watching her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in the hospital, and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me, but how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her, and that her husband, my granddad, had gone already. She went in her sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really digesting it in any way, that writing this just tore my heart out. I miss them both so much, but I know they're finally together again somewhere.
I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls. Literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them, we just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the docs said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out, she didn't really give a shit about owls. Near as we could piece together sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember. But from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a pot holder or placemat. And all of a sudden, her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early.
Not really a confession, but a story nonetheless. My nan used to give me daisies whenever I felt sick or upset, and I'd always give her daisies from the garden on her birthdays. Basically, daisies were our little gesture to show we cared about each other. I thought it was just between us, but when she was in the hospital, she told me the story behind them. Apparently, the love of her life ran a flower shop in Bristol. On Nan's first week in town, she was checking out all the shops in the downtown area of the city, and she came across that very flower shop. She talked to her love, the shop lady, for the first time that day. Nan ordered a bouquet of daisies, because why not? The shop lady went to the back room to get the fresh daisies, and they tripped over one another when she got out. Apparently, this was a real-life version of the trip and kiss scenes because they fell and their lips smashed. And the daisies got all over the floor and in their hair. So they started seeing each other at the shops, they'd get malts, eat dinners, etc. But they never really became girlfriends. Nan knew she was in love, but also knew that your relationships were not at all accepted at the time. So for her own safety, she never voiced her feelings. After a few years of the ladies getting along as good friends with benefits, the shop lady was diagnosed with cancer. Nan would bring her daisies at the hospital every day and would pray for her and such, but it was no use. Medical technology was not advanced enough to help the shop lady. Apparently, the two were talking together on the shop lady's last night of life. They practically confessed their loves, but one of the last things that Nan said was, "Do you remember the time when we first met? With the daisies? So sweet. I'll never look at daisies the same again. I miss my Nan a lot now. She probably would have disproven of the way my mum and dad act to me now."
Not a deathbed confession per se. My bio-grandfather was an angry drunk racist. He was a jerk to my dad, such as pointing a gun to his face. You get the picture. Well, when I was 2, I suppose, my dad thought he was okay enough to let me be around him. He insisted he babysit me and let my parents go on a date. When they got back, I was home alone, sobbing. He pulls up with more beer shortly after. My dad and him fight. Turns out he ran out of beer and needed to get more. Since he didn't have a car seat, he left me at the house and he was going to be right back. My dad told him he's leaving and he will never see us again. Grandfather disappeared after that. He had already left my grandma and my aunt, so no one knew what happened to him. Till my dad got the call that he died. He told me he wants to go, but asked me not to come with. I accepted this. I understood his reason. He came back with a face of mixed emotions. Turns out he remarried and turned his life around. This was the convy he had with his widow. Widow: "Sir, I don't know who your dad was, but that's not my husband. But can you help answer a question?" Dad: "Yes, ma'am, what's the matter?" Widow: "Well, in his wallet he kept this picture and he never said why. It was a picture of me. We speculate I'm the reason he turned his life around and passed as a better person."
Around the time my grandfather was really declining, he started making strange remarks about a group of people that we were unfamiliar with, a lot of war stories, as well as the word kitchens over and over. He started talking about kitchens, and we just thought it was ramblings and nonsense. After he passed, when we were cleaning out their house, we came upon an old family book that was handwritten by his grandfather. It was about the Denver bootleg years, focusing on a certain character who managed to run one of the bigger bootlegging operations in the area during Prohibition. Then we came across some pictures in a box with a bunch of pins and a sash that was from the Masons. The pictures all had my grandfather and his father posing with family members, as well as a random old guy dressed in what can only be described as a 1940s-era suit and hat that made him look like an old-school gangster. We then found out that there's a house that my aunt used to go to when she was a very young child that was supposedly owned by that old man in the photos. When I did some scoping on the property, it does not have a registered number on the street it resides, and is instead registered as an address that is 1 block over. The house has no real address, and it is owned by a company that is run by some guy that my aunt and mom know to be related to us. At this point, we think the Kitchens was a pseudo-name for someone my grandfather was associated with within the Masons, and that this Kitchens fellow may be the man in the photos, as well as even the inspiration for the main character in the handwritten book we found buried in the closet.
Not really confessions, but I recall 2 stories of deathbed conversations that stuck with me. One was my friend's grandpa, who was always known to be a loving but stern man. Used to drink and sleep a lot. On his deathbed, he asked my friend to come closer and told him, "I've left a lot of money to you. Life's not worth it. Spend it all. Spend it all on hookers and drugs." And died about a week later. Don't know if he spent it on hookers and drugs, but he did spend it. The other story is my grandma. She was always abused physically and emotionally by my grandfather. When she started showing signs of Alzheimer's, my grandpa turned up the abuse and started kicking her and pinching her. So we took her in her last months. On her deathbed a few days before her passing, my grandpa came visiting and pinched her cheeks and messed with her, expecting no resistance. And she had a moment of clarity and snapped. She swatted away his hand and shouted, "Stop it, I'm sick of you and your ways. Go, leave now. I don't ever want to see you again, not ever." She was always a sweet and happy woman, and watching her stand up for herself at last always makes me smile.
Not a confession, but a denial, and solid information that helped us clear a few pending matters. I worked for a federal law enforcement agency. We covered major felonies, some of which relate to organized crime. Not mafia per se, but open-ended criminal enterprises. We had a mid-level player as suspect for a string of cargo thefts, robberies, etc. Knew him for years. Arrested him several times. He taunted us a fair bit. Lung cancer got hold of him before we could build a solid case. Things went downhill fast. Went to see him at home, just before he transferred to hospice. That he did at least 50% of what we suspected is an open secret. I knew it. He knew it. For whatever reason, chose to give me a break. He said, "If I give you something, will you sit on it for a few weeks?" Initially, I could not agree. What if he was going to leak info about something in progress, etc.? He assured me that it could wait. I agreed. "So," he said, "I know that you are looking at me for the las mama nyasan. I didn't do it." He admitted wanting to do it, told me who was responsible and where we could find solid evidence to implicate 5 to 6 people. "Why did he tell me?" said the other guy. "Never treated anybody right." Did not ask him to elaborate. I moved on the info about 3 weeks later, after the informant died. Never had to share info source because he pointed us to substantial corroborating info.
I wasn't there to witness her confession, but the story leading up to it is intriguing. My mom was adopted, and my grandparents never kept it a secret. They loved my mom like their own. When she was growing up, she tried to find out as much as she could about her and her adopted brother's birth parents. Back in those days, though, info like that wasn't exactly the easiest to find. My mom and uncle were brought to the orphanage with little to info on each of their biological parents, or was else wise requested to be kept secret. Eventually, my mom found enough info from notes she had gathered, like which families might have been most likely to be related to her, some property info one can find at the library, and she just sort of pieced this puzzle together over her life. At a certain point, she was able to get the names of her mother and her brother's mother. She was able to find out she was part of a big family with lots of brothers and sisters. But for my uncle, he found out that his mother had died not long after placing him for adoption. By the time she had gathered all of this info and found this much out, my mom was married, had my older sister, and was pregnant with me. I can't remember exactly what it was she found that led to it, or if she heard something from someone, but she got a phone number. That phone number went to the house of her biological mother. She called, and the voice of a young boy answered. My mom asked for the name she knew, and she hears, "Yeah, 1 second. Hey mom, phone's for you." My mom and her mom talk. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I'm just gonna refer to my mom's mom as Bio Gran from here. Bio Gran is not comfortable with my mom contacting her at all. She doesn't ask my mom a lot of questions, but my mom says that she was just gonna talk, and if Bio Gran wanted to hang up at any point, she could. My mom just gave her a short version of the story of her life, and then the conversation was over. Bio Gran after that would send letters to my mom on occasion, but Bio Gran made a point of telling my mom she could never be found out by the rest of her family. And Bio Gran carried that secret with her until the day of her death. One of her daughters asked her, "Will you tell us where you went when you went away that time?" And Bio Gran finally confessed. She had gone to a home for unwed mothers all those years ago to have my mom, the child of her affair. I've met 2 of my bio aunts, and sadly, both of them passed a few years ago. But dang. TLDR, my biological grandmother had an affair with a milkman, left to go to a home for unwed mothers, had a child, did not tell her family until her deathbed.
Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty shape, except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home, and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. Seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say, "Used to be a whorehouse there." Empty lot, used to be a building there, and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down. We passed by this old odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have, and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said, "That used to be a crib, and each door had a small room behind it, and each whore had her own room." We passed under a railroad bridge, and he pointed a flat area, and there used to be a black woman that ran the best whorehouse in the state right there. I finally laughed and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing."
My great-grandfather was in his mid-90s when he died. Health was always good, but a benign tumor deemed too dangerous to operate on at his age went septic. He was dead a week later. I went to visit him in the hospital. My family used to see him a lot, but there was a falling out between him and my grandma several years before, so we stopped seeing them. Funny enough, though, I constantly ran into him at the store, and we always had nice chats. Anyway, in the hospital, he told me not to worry about him. Most everyone he's ever known was dead, and he was ready to die. The week he felt himself getting sick, he knew something was off and made arrangements to get my great-grandma into a nursing home. He took care of her with her Alzheimer's, so he wouldn't die until he knew she was taken care of. They were married for over 70 years. My favorite story is that every Sunday for over 50 years, he would drop my great-grandma off at church and then sat in the car and waited for her. Hated religion, but loved his wife Lowell.